Hi there. Thanks for joining us at Programmers Week. For those of you who don't know me, I am Jon Reding, and I am a senior automation engineer at Cognizant Softvision. I've contributed to several automation frameworks within and outside of our organization, and I've been here for about 7 years. Today, I'm going to be showing you some stuff about automating accessibility scanning, and I invite everyone to share any questions they have in the chat module on the side, and I'd be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. So without further anticipation, let's get going. So a little bit about me. As I said, I've been in the industry about 6 years. Most of it has been with UI and web services, so Selenium testing. And right now I've been working on frameworks outside of the organization, mainly with DQ for about 3. And this is just open source contributions. So a lot of the stuff that I've done has been on my own free time. There's also my LinkedIn and GitHub if you want to follow me and find me at those, so feel free to. So let's start with the main question that a lot of people don't really know about accessibility. What is it? Well, accessibility is what allows your websites to be accessible to as many people as possible. So this means people with disabilities, and we'll go over the different types later on, but overall, anything that can hinder their access to websites and the internet and whatever application that you have. Traditionally, it is with people with disabilities, and it aids other groups using mobile devices. It can also help those with very slow network connections, so out more into the rural areas, those people, it can also benefit them. Now, the one thing that's kind of important here is that mobile apps are becoming very, very popular and have been for many years, but there are a huge amount of people using those apps. So it's actually very important because it's a huge market and it's a way to actually make apps on the phone easy to use. So up next, why is accessibility important? First big thing is that you can actually be sued if you are not meeting the accessibility requirements. Now, right here, I have some examples of lawsuits that have happened, and it's just been within the last 10 years. And with this article that I got, it's just 2021, and this was back in July 7th. The lawsuits have been increasing since then. So this isn't just an issue that has been in the past, it's something that's happening now, and it's actually increasing ever more significantly. So a lot of companies you see here, like Netflix, Nike, Amazon, and Domino's, a lot of what you're going to see is that people are suing because of being inaccessible for being visually impaired. So a lot of it is no closed captioning, no reading tools on the internet. So the tool that does it is that it's like a computerized voice that reads out things for you. So a lot of what's going on with these lawsuits is something that can easily be fixed if worked on and actually made easier to fix. So next, injury types. So right over here, we have 3 different types: permanent, temporary, and situational. So usually when we say accessibility, a lot of people are thinking about the permanent injuries. It's like you only have one arm, you can't see, you're deaf, and those kind of ones. Well, what about the instances where you break your arm or wrist and you can't use your dominant hand? In the industry for tech, that's crucial because we need 2 of our hands to be fully functional. Try typing in your password with 1 hand at a time and time yourself. It's significantly slower than if you had done it 2 hands. So accessibility isn't just for people who are have significant disabilities. It's for those, even for us who have a bad fall or an accident that hinders us by using the computer. The other thing is that it's a huge growing niche market. These are the several of the companies that I could find that are actually participating in it. And you'll see right now that I have DQ outlined because today I'm going to be showing you some automation work that I've done that has been specifically with DQ. This doesn't mean that There are other automation frameworks that are used for accessibility. It's just today we will be focusing on DQ because that's what I've been working in and I have a lot of knowledge about it. So on to the next one. Another big thing is that a lot of big companies are adopting accessibility practices. This is anything from Microsoft, Boeing, Intel, Delta, just a ton of these huge companies that are starting to adopt these practices and taking it on. Even look at EY and PwC. Both are competitors and are taking on a lot of these different specifications and requirements. So next, who determines accessibility? Well, there are several organizations that kind of oversee what they determine accessibility to be and what violates what. So you have several groups here: the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, the World Wide Web Consortium, Web Accessibility Initiative, and the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Now, WCAG is the main one that DQ uses and acts. So usually that's the one we go by, and that's kind of the main focus that we do. The most current version is 2.1, but 3.0 will be out sooner or later. They are all working on it. And the nice thing about the WCAG versions is that it adds on and includes the past requirements. So as time goes on, the requirements add on instead of getting rid of others. So Axe. DQ has a tool called Axe, and I think it's the tool to use right now. What it does is that it scans and creates reports of elements on your page or app. The reason why I think it's handy is that it supports several different languages. Today we'll be going over Java and C# specifically, but it also is supported in Python, Ruby, and JavaScript. It also supports multiple browsers, so the usual big three: Chrome, Firefox, and Edge, and also does IE and Safari. Now, the main thing about Axe is that it goes through the entire DOM and also includes iframes. So we can even test iframes with Axe. Right down here, we go where to find it. We have core, which in this case, we aren't going to necessarily use, but core is the main branch that trails off to Java and C#. So the Java framework for Axe is using the core content. So how Axe works? Well, it's very simple, but what you do is you open your browser, you let a JavaScript file in the Axe code scan your page, and then that scan output returns a JSON object format. Now, today I'll be showing you that aspect of scanning, but also to show how that is a limitation, and also give an example of how we're actually improving that process and making that JSON object format easier to use. So what you need for both of these is Visual Studio for C# or Visual Studio Code. Today I'm going to be using Visual Studio to give an example of the C# code. And for Java, you just need the community edition of IntelliJ, which I will be using today. So let's do a little bit of scanning. So I shall start with the Java part. So the first thing I'm going to go over is that JSON file that we got. And now I'm going to make it a little bit prettier so that we can kind of see more of the object format. But this huge file that we get from the scan looks very much like this. And it's not necessarily easy to read for us to understand, or even really gives us an explanation of how to fix it. So the next step that we kind of came up with is that we get a text value of it. So this is a little bit of a step up from the JSON file, but at the same time, it still doesn't really fulfill an easy way to see everything and gives us a really good organizational structure. So the main thing we want is something more that's a little bit easier to see. And pull that out. There we go. Something that looks a little bit more like this. What we have here is an HTML object that shows us all the information that we have. It shows us, for instance, what kind of type that we're looking at, and even gives us a little bit of a basis of what things look like. So this, I'll show a better example later on, but this gives us a little bit of an easier way to look at our data and figure out what the problems are and what the issues are. So the main thing that we can get from this is that we can run these scans and get an HTML file to show us exactly what we need. And how that works is that we have this object called Axe Builder, and that we feed that with a WebDriver, and that produces our results. Now, our results are separated into 4 different types: violations, inapplicable, incomplete, and passes. Most of the time, you'll probably be focusing on violations and inapplicable, maybe sometimes incompletes, but passes are usually, depends on the project. So what you do is you feed it in and you get this result. Now this result contains those 4 types, and you can get them by getting those different types. Now, right here, I'm showing the text version of it, but if I go to more of the HTML file report, what you do is you send in a WebDriver, you give the destination or path that you want, and the file name at the end, all within the same string. Now this is going to create your file to wherever you want it to go. So I'm just going to dig deep in here, kind of show what it does. And so if we go all the way down to the bottom one here, we have our search context, which is usually our WebDriver, our results, our string destination, so our file of where we want to go, and the requested results, which you will see is a set. So the nice thing about some of the functionality we have for this HTML report is that we can actually dictate which report type we want, result type. So I can say, hey, I just want the violations. That's all I want. I don't want any of the other ones. So if I go back here, I can go down to my test here and I can go, hey, I just want to get the violations and see how many violations there were. And now I can compare and say, hey, okay, so I have these many violations and I can get away with 5. I'm willing to go with 5, and I can actually create a unit test to say, hey, how many violations do we have? Is it less than 5? Or is it greater than 5? Let's fail the test. If it's less than 5, great, cool. We can pass the test. This is good for something for more when you get into the CI build of everything. You can fail your build if your accessibility requirements don't meet the standards. So going back into how this is built. So this is built with a repository called JSoup. And so what JSoup does is that it is a repository that puts together an HTML file. So as we see down here, there's all these element objects. This is where we create all these objects that you see within our HTML page. So what we do with JSoup is that JSoup allows us to create this HTML document, dictate how we structure it, and actually put out information. And then we push the HTML file back out, which is like this, what you see here. So in certain instances, like I was talking about before, we have the single result type that we want to take a look at, and that looks a little bit like this. So we don't see anything about the incompletes or the passes or the inapplicables. All we see is just the violations. So it's really handy that we have a file like this that gives us just the single things that we're looking for. And so when we go about looking for the different types in Java, we can specify 1, 2, 3, or all 4 by the enum set right here, but this is how it is done. And that's what allows us to select exactly what we want for our HTML report. So I'm going to go over to the C# side of things. And so as you'll see, Java and C# are very, very similar, but a big thing about the C# acts is that we don't actually call acts directly. We use the WebDriver to access that repository. You'll also notice that the C# acts doesn't get us back that text file or that JSON file. Right now, the HTML file is just the base thing that we need, or base thing that it's provided. And so if we take a look at this guy, this one's a little bit more updated than the Java one, but as you can see, we have a lot more information now. So not only do we get the HTML object and the selector, we also get solutions on how to solve the problem. And this is the initial solution that we're trying to go for here, is that a lot of the aspects of accessibility is that there's not really anything out there to make the process easier to give companies incentives to make their project better. Right now, we're trying to create something that we can basically scan with automation, get an HTML file, hand it to a front-end or back-end developer and say, hey, here are the changes that we want. This can make things a lot easier for bigger companies because now the discussion of covering accessibility becomes more of a testing focus rather than a legal focus. It's something that they can actually look into and bring within the scope of their projects. So looking at and comparing the two, you'll see that the C# version also allows you to specify which result types you want. There are a lot of similarities and differences to both of the language models, but for the most part, they are pretty much one-to-one, very, very equal. So what is great about it is that they all look very similar when going down to the base level as intended, so that both Java and the C# version can be used kind of interchangeably and are easy to use in either languages. So I think next I'll minimize this and bring it to the side, but I'm going to do a little bit of a comparison between the two side by side and kind of give a general look at how similar they are as intended. So we got the get HTML report. And so similarities and differences. Right here, the WebDriver is something that we have to input into the Java version, while in C# that's already taken care of. However, the destinations for both Java and C# have the same format. So it's a lot easier to use right there. Now, setting up these projects is kind of a deal to itself. So I'll just go over how you set this up. So go to what I have installed. And for the most part, we have a .NET Test, .NET Adapter, MS Test Framework. I have downloaded Axe. Right now, I am using 3.0.1. I have Selenium support, Selenium driver, and that is the Chrome driver. Sorry, that's the normal driver, and that one is, one of them is the Chrome driver. That's fine. And so all those kind of piece together and can bring you into a cohesive unit test and kind of a base framework for what you can work with. For the Java side, take a look at my POM here. I'm gonna start at the top. And what we have is we're using JUnit. We're using the Axe Core framework. We're using the Selenium org. I'm using this guy right here. This is for the binaries, handling your WebDriver and making sure that I don't need to care about that stuff. And then here is the accessibility of JMax. So here's the thing with Java and C#. The thing is with the Java version is that you don't get the HTML functionality that you do with the C# side. So all these files here have all been done with JMax. They haven't been done with the base Java Axe system. Now, for those who don't know what JMax is a test automation framework. It's an acronym for Java Magenic Automation Quick Start. So it's a quick starting automation framework that makes things quicker and a lot easier to start up for unit testing. So a lot of the work when it comes to the HTML version of things has been done with JMax. So it's just another dependency that you have to add to your project, but it gives you a whole lot more ability to look at all the problems that you have. Now, the main thing with Java, which you probably noticed, is that there are a lot of features missing with Java that aren't there with the C# version. And me personally, I've been working in both frameworks consistently. The Java version is definitely behind, but is in progress to try and catch up with the other version. C# has always kind of been the front runner and had kind of the main ideas because it was a little bit easier to work with things and kind of was a main focus to work on. The Java version has many things in progress, and we're looking to try and get all the features up to date with the C# side soon. It's an ongoing process, but it's part of a very large and useful framework. So as we get more into builds for overall projects, especially CI builds, we want to use this as a tool. And a great way to do that is to utilize both by getting those HTML reports so that we can hand off to the developers or front-end developers that need to work on it and improve the sites. Whatever one you go with, both are handy and can be useful. It just depends on what languages you're using and what languages the client wants to use. And so with that, are there any questions?
Hi, John. I don't see any questions in the chat at this time. We've got some rounds of applause, thumbs up, and thanks for the talk.
Thank you. Thank you for attending.